Kira Mikutaitis, she's an undergraduate art history major, and her paper today is No Snake Pit Now, How the Department of Mental Health Sought to Improve Its Image with the Most Unlikely of Buildings. Kira.
Thank you, Dr. Brandt. Hi, everybody. It's going to be over soon, I promise. I would actually like to start off with a brief disclaimer and cover the term criminal insanity so that we can all be on the same page. I'll be using the terms criminal insanity and criminally insane quite often in my presentation. And because this term has legal as well as social implications, I would like to first define it for everyone. The textbook definition of criminal insanity is a defendant must be so impaired by mental disease or defect at the time of the act that he or she did not know the nature or quality of the act, or if the defendant did know the nature or quality of the act, he or she did not know that the act was wrong. This defense, though does not in modern courts include people with antisocial or sociopathic personality disorders, because the terms mental disease or defect do not include an abnormality that is manifest only by repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. Thus, many times, people that modern society would claim are insane do not use the insanity plea, such as Pee Wee Gaskins, or their use of the plea fails, like John Wayne Gacy. Now that you have an understanding of the terminology, I will discuss the buildings for the criminally insane at the South Carolina State Hospital. In the 1940s and 50s, the public opinion of mental health centers was generally that of unsanitary living conditions and torturous surgical procedures. These opinions were exacerbated in Columbia by the horrific living conditions and generally dreary facade of the Taylor Building, which was used to house the criminally insane patients at the South Carolina State Hospital. In 1954, the State Hospital sought to change the public's opinion and improve the image of mental health in South Carolina by the creation of 4 new wards on the campus, brimming with technological advancements. In the mid-1900s, the public's opinion of mental health institutions was that they were torture chambers. This view mainly stemmed from the horrific practices of some mental institutions, such as lobotomies, electric shock, and insulin therapy, many of which were never practiced at the South Carolina State Hospital. They were also influenced by the poor living conditions due to lack of funds at the state hospital and by depictions of mental health in movies and documentaries that had become popular through the 1940s and 60s. My title, which comes from a state newspaper article about the new wards, is a reference to a movie about a woman trapped in an insane asylum, which came out in 1948. All of this lends itself to a public afraid of mental health institutions and leads South Carolina State Hospital to try to change their image. The original building created to house the criminally insane at the South Carolina State Hospital was the Taylor Building. It was located in the lower east corner of Babcock and was built in the late 1800s to house 180 patients. It was originally created to house the violently insane, since at this point, criminal insanity was not a common defense. But by the early 1900s, the judicial system was sentencing people to institutions. Taylor was a 3-story castle-like structure, which was, even in its prime, very imposing. Due to years of overcrowding and poor funding, by 1943, it was deteriorating, and by the mid-1950s, the building was falling apart. The public's opinion of Taylor was not very good due to the poor living conditions and general disrepair of the buildings. For the example, the building had been condemned as far back as 1925 by the Fire Department and the State Department of Mental Health. In 1951, a visitor from the American Psychiatric Associates described it as a disgrace. And in 1952, when legislators visited, they found that 90% of the inhabitants were unclothed. It was also coming apart at its seams. The large cracks in the foundation were causing cracks in the walls, and the facilities, including the kitchens, were, as one reporter described them in 1955, medieval, and ground out questionable cuisine. Overall, this building was an eyesore and desperately needed replacing. The decision to continue to house the criminally insane at the South Carolina State Hospital was not an easy decision. There were many correspondences between the Superintendent of Corrections and the Superintendent of the State Hospital. The Superintendent of Corrections at the time was Wyndham M. Manning. and the superintendent of the state hospital was William S. Hall. Manning and Hall had continued correspondence through the 1940s to the 1960s about whether or not the criminally insane should be the responsibility of the mental health department, or are they the responsibility of the Department of Corrections? Many possible solutions were proposed by both men, such as a wing devoted to mental health at the state penitentiary, run either by the mental health department or the corrections department, the development of new wards at the state hospital, and even housing the criminally insane with the general populace in the state penitentiary. In all of these, neither man wanted the criminally insane housed at their facility, because they thought it would lower the quality of treatment of their other patients and inmates respectively, and because of budget concerns. But in 1953, the mental health department was given a $5 million building bond to make repairs and build new buildings, and they decided to create 4 new wards to house the criminally insane at the state hospital. The original plans for the new wards were drawn up in 1943 by architecture firm Lafay, Fair & Lafay. They were shelved due to budget concerns. When the $5 million bond was approved in 1953, they revamped the old plans and started to look for contractors to start the new building. They built the wards on a large plot of land in the back portion of the plot owned by the state hospital. The wards were far away from the central buildings of the state hospital, possibly to differentiate them from the former disgrace of the Taylor building. The contractors who eventually built the buildings were the Daniel Construction Company. The construction company was given very specific set of guidelines outlining the construction and furnishing of the ward buildings. They built a total of 4 wards, 2 to house men and 2 to house women, and they would house a total capacity of 608 patients. Each building was furnished with the best technology of the time. The buildings had state-of-the-art examination rooms and kitchens, and even had amenities such as exercise spaces, and the men's buildings had barber shops, while the women's buildings had beauty parlors. They were monumental goals for the state hospital, and they cost a monumental sum, each costing around $700,000 and a total of $3 million, which in today's money is the equivalent of $25 million. The buildings were even named progressively. The buildings are Preston, Cooper, Saunders, and Allen, after William Preston and Thomas Cooper, both members of the Board of Regents and presidents of the University of South Carolina, and Sarah Allen and Eleanora B. Saunders, the first and second women physicians at the South Carolina State Hospital, respectively. These buildings were also the only buildings named after women on the campus at the time. They were to show people of South Carolina that the state hospital was no longer a disgrace and that they were moving forward. The wards were completed in December of 1954, and as soon as they were done, the state hospital wanted to show them off to the public, so they planned for an open house to showcase to the public the new and improved state hospital. But before any of the public stepped foot in the buildings, they invited members of the state legislature to partake in the many amenities and see how advanced they were. They perused the buildings while nurses acted as hostesses and gave them tours. The female legislators even got their hair done at the beauty parlor in the women's wards. They got to see the new appliances and the setup of the kitchens, which would be able to serve all 4 buildings without taxing the already stressed kitchens of the main campus. Then, on January 22nd of 1955, the doors were opened to the public in 2-hour stints. They were invited by the superintendent to tour the buildings. While they were there, they saw the efficiently arranged buildings with hallways built so that one nurse could monitor many patients at one time, and private visiting rooms. They also saw unbreakable glass windows and mirrors which offered the criminally insane patients a luxury rarely seen at this kind of facility. They saw lighting controls at the nurse's station that controlled all of the lights on her hall, and they examined the fenced-in recreation areas with climb-proof fences, saw dishwashers and walk-in refrigerators, and they were impressed. As one reporter said, these buildings incorporate the newest and most modern methods in care for the mentally disturbed. The public had never before seen such new advancements, and they were rarely invited to explore the grounds of the state hospital. Shortly after the open house, the patients were moved in, and the buildings were no longer on display. So these buildings succeeded in changing the opinions of the people of Columbia about mental health for a while, but not even 40 years later, in the early 1990s, most of the facilities for long-term care at what was at the time was known as the South Carolina Department of Mental Health were closed for good. From what I can tell, criminally insane were moved to new facilities and are currently housed at the G. Weber Bryan Psychiatric Hospital, a secure facility with a division specifically for the treatment of the criminally insane. but many of the general population were switched to community care and were only interned in institutional care for short periods of time. In conclusion, I think the creation of these wards is just one of the many examples of the continued progressive attitude of the Department of Mental Health here in South Carolina over its many years of existence. I believe that it is the most sincere hope of all of us that you take from these presentations the knowledge that this facility was not the common person stereotype of a mental health care facility. This was a progressive place where the good outweighed the bad, and that many of the individuals who worked for the Department of Mental Health over the years were caring people who truly wanted to help those interned in their care.